Mordecai Nunu. This is a tale of intrigue, state secrets, undercover operations, and sexy seductress, betrayal, classic spy story of Mordecai Nunu, who was the insider and had the guts to reveal the truth. The proof that state of Israel produces weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. It begins back in the past when Israel went to war with Iraq because they thought Iraq could have nuclear weapons. Israel and Iraq have been implacable since 1948. Iraq sent its troops to participate in 1948 Arab-Israeli War and later backed Egypt and Syria in 1967 Six-Day War and in 1973 Yom Kippur War. So in June 1981, Israel attacked and destroyed newly built Iraqi nuclear facilities in Operation Opera. It's apparently well-known fact that Israel also had nuclear weapons for the past 18 years. There in the middle of the desert there is a secret nuclear reactor where Mordecai Nunu worked as a scientist. Mr. Nunu had been a technician for 9 years at Israeli top-secret nuclear site where they produce plutonium 6 level below the ground. Israel had built secretly a plutonium processing plant and a nuclear bomb factory. To this day, Israel still refused to acknowledge its existence to the world. In fact, Mike Kanstein, a former Israeli soldier, also told Bella Habib that he got a high radiation dosage in Israeli army. That fact also proves the Mr. Nunu story. 18 years ago, in spectacular fashion, Mr. Nunu blew top secret cover and became first Israeli whistleblower to inform the world about Israeli nuclear secrets because no one else was allowed to speak about it nor to report exactly what was going on. In 1986, the same year Chernobyl nuclear reactor number 4 blew up in Ukraine. Mr. Nunu duped Israeli security apparatus and smuggled a camera into secret nuclear facility. His photographs exposed the world's greatest nuclear cover-up. He showed Israeli nuclear arms program was far bigger and much more powerful than anyone had ever dreamed of. There was possible enough material to produce 10 nuclear bombs every year, and Nunu fled Israel and set out across the world with his top secrets on 2 rolls of unexposed film in his backpack. He traveled through Europe and Asia and ended up in Australia, where he converted to Christianity from Judaism in a King's Cross church. Mr. Nunu took the photos to Britain and the Sunday Times newspapers, where they realized the immense importance of the information he had. But by now, the Israel had got wind of what Mr. Nunu was up to. Mossad were after Mr. Nunu. They set up a trap with a kind of bait, a honey trap using a hot woman. Mr. Nunu, being a young, lonely single man, was wandering around the streets, and then he bought a cigarette and he saw a hot woman standing there buying a cigarette as well, looking at him smiling. She was beautiful and super friendly. Her smile warmed up Mr. Nunu's mood because he was lonely. The woman said her name was Candice and she was a honey pot for Mr. Nunu set up by Mossad. So they hooked up and fell in love. Mr. Nunu suspected nothing suspicious when Candice suggested a romantic trip for them to Rome, but of course it was a trap. As soon as they arrived at Rome, they had a 40-minute drive from Rome airport to a suburban house venue, and it was Mr. Nunu's last moments as a free man, because when he entered the house, the 2 men immediately jumped on him, kicked him in the stomach, he collapsed, another man placed his hand on Mr. Nunu's mouth, silencing him. Then Candice came and injected Nunu with something that made him to lose his consciousness. Mr. Nunu was kidnapped and was secretly shipped to Israel, where they charged him with treason, making him to be a prisoner of his own country. Mr. Nunu will never be allowed to leave Israel ever. Israeli government of course denied that they had anything to do with Mr. Nunu's disappearance, but they did charge him with espionage and treason. So apparently kidnapping isn't a crime if it's done by government, special intelligence. The Israeli government claims that they have a right to defend the state, and the chairman of Defense Committee in Israel Parliament stated under such circumstances Israel was allowed and it's still allowed to defend itself. However, Mr. Nunu himself craftily exposed the details of his abduction. He wrote even and concealed the basic facts on the palm of his hand, and the critical moment flashed it to the media as he was driven to the trial. Mr. Nunu was convicted of espionage and treason and sentenced to 18 years in jail. Even after serving his term, Mr. Nunu, not a free man, he cannot leave Israel. He is forbidden to approach any airports or go closer than 250 meters to any embassy and even talk to foreigners. Mordecai Nunu is now 50 years old, and all he has for the last 18 years was a jail room full of books and letters from his followers and admirers. All he wants is to be a free man, to feel freedom again, but that could only happen when he leaves Israel.